A sprawling cattle ranch, a tight-knit rural community, and a widow raising her children in the heart of America's heartland. It should have been a peaceful life for Elizabeth Carson after her husband's passing, but when the notorious Blackwell gang set their sights on her land and threatened her family, they made one fatal mistake: they underestimated her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elizabeth isn't just a grieving rancher's widow. She's a former Special Forces combat instructor, a woman who spent years training elite soldiers in survival and warfare. And after settling in Oak Ridge Valley, she quietly taught every rancher, farmhand and shopkeeper in town how to defend themselves. The moment the Blackwells threatened her children, they didn't just make an enemy of Elizabeth Carson, they made an enemy of the entire town. But just when she thought she knew who she was fighting, a mysterious warning arrived that suggested a darker conspiracy at work. Tonight, we bring you the gripping tale of a mother who transformed from a quiet window to the leader of an unlikely militia, standing against criminals who thought they could rule through fear. As the battle for Oak Ridge Valley escalates, will Elizabeth uncover the truth behind the threats before her family pays the ultimate price? Elizabeth Carson stood at the edge of her property, the setting sun painting the vast Montana sky in shades of amber and gold. The Carson Ranch stretched before her, 2,000 acres of prime cattle land that had been in her late husband's family for 3 generations. 6 months ago, Michael's heart had given out while mending fences on the north pasture. At 42, Elizabeth had found herself a widow with 2 teenage children and a ranch to run. The wind swept across the tall prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of pine from the distant mountains. Elizabeth tucked a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear, her keen hazel eyes surveying the landscape with a mixture of love and determination. This land wasn't just property, it was her children's inheritance, their future, their home. "Mom?" Emma's voice called from the ranch house behind her. "Dinner's almost ready." Elizabeth turned to see her 16-year-old daughter standing on the porch, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Emma had Michael's gentle eyes and kind spirit. Behind her, 14-year-old Jack was setting the table through the window, his lanky frame already promising the height his father had possessed. "I'll be right there," Elizabeth called back with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She took one last look at the horizon, where storm clouds were gathering. Something didn't feel right. The cattle had been restless all week, and Parker Williams, who owned the neighboring ranch, had reported missing livestock. Small things had been disappearing from properties throughout Oak Ridge Valley. Equipment, supplies, even vehicles. Sheriff Roy Tanner had dismissed it as opportunistic theft, but Elizabeth recognized the pattern. In her former life, before she'd met Michael, before she'd traded in her military uniform for flannel shirts and worn jeans, she'd been trained to identify threats. This wasn't random. This was scouting, preparation for something bigger. As she walked back to the house, the familiar weight of her concealed handgun pressed against her lower back. Some habits never died, even after 15 years of civilian life. The dining room was warm and inviting, filled with the aroma of Emma's beef stew, Michael's recipe that their daughter had perfected in the months since his passing. Jack had just finished setting the table, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he placed the last of the silverware. "I saw the Henderson truck heading toward town earlier," Jack said, as Elizabeth took her seat at the head of the table. "Billy mentioned they had another break-in last night?" Elizabeth nodded, serving herself a helping of stew. "What did they take this time?" "Tools, mostly, but also their backup generator." Emma frowned as she passed the breadbasket. "That's the 3rd ranch this month. What's Sheriff Tanner doing about it?" Elizabeth kept her voice even. "He's doing what He can, with limited resources. What she didn't say was that Roy Tanner was a good man, but out of his depth. Oak Ridge Valley had been peaceful for so long that the sheriff's department had become complacent, understaffed, and undertrained. That's why Elizabeth had quietly begun training the locals over the past few years. Simple self-defense at first, then more advanced techniques as they showed interest. It had started with just a few of Michael's friends, ranchers concerned about increasing reports of trouble in neighboring counties. Now, almost every adult in town had received some form of training from her. Most folks just thought she was sharing skills from her time as a military instructor. Few knew she had been part of an elite unit that specialized in teaching combatives to special forces operatives. The conversation shifted to school and ranch matters as they ate, but Elizabeth's mind kept drifting to the pattern of thefts. After dinner, with the kids upstairs finishing homework, she spread out a map of the valley on the kitchen table. Red pins marked every reported theft or disturbance in the past 3 months. The pattern was clear. They were working their way toward the center of the valley, toward the largest properties, toward the Carson Ranch. Her satellite phone buzzed, one of her security measures after Michael died. Few people had the number. "Carson," she answered. "Liz, it's Clay. Clayton Moore, owner of the general store in town and a Vietnam veteran who'd been one of the first to take Elizabeth's training seriously. We need to talk. Something's happening." Elizabeth glanced at the clock. Nearly 9 p.m. "I'm listening." "Not over the phone. I'll be at your place in 20. The line went dead. Elizabeth tucked the phone away and checked her security monitors. The ranch had cameras covering every approach, another precaution that had raised eyebrows when she'd installed them 3 years ago. Nothing unusual showed on the screens, but she activated the perimeter alerts anyway. Clay's truck pulled up at exactly 9:20 p.m. Elizabeth met him on the porch, watching as the older man climbed out, his movements stiff from an old war injury. His weathered face was grave in the porch light. "They're here," he said without preamble, accepting the mug of coffee she handed him as they sat in the rocking chairs overlooking the property. "Who's here, Clay?" "The Blackwell gang." He took a sip of coffee, his hand slightly trembling. "Spotted them at the watering hole earlier today. 3 of them, asking questions about the biggest ranches in the area." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The Blackwells were notorious across 3 states, a family-run criminal operation that specialized in land grabs through intimidation, violence, and eventually forced sales. They'd leave a trail of broken families and stolen properties across Wyoming and Idaho over the past 5 years. "Did they mention any ranches specifically?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Clay nodded grimly. "Yours was top of their list. They were asking about you, Liz, about the kids, about how you've been managing since Michael passed." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "I appreciate the warning." "It's more than a warning. Word is they've set up at the old Miller property out by Crescent Creek. That's less than 10 miles from here. The abandoned Miller farm had been vacant for years. Its isolated location making it perfect for someone looking to establish a base of operations without drawing attention. How many? At least 8 that we know of. Jeb Walker says he spotted vehicles coming and going. Based on what I saw today, Blake Blackwell himself is leading this particular operation. Blake Blackwell, the eldest son and the most dangerous of the bunch. Elizabeth had read reports about him during her occasional consultations with law enforcement after she'd left active service. He was smart, methodical, and utterly ruthless. "We need to warn the others," Elizabeth said, her mind already calculating. "Possibilities, escape routes, defensive positions." Clay shook his head. "Already started making calls. Ryan at the feed store is spreading the word tomorrow. We've got your back, Liz." I never doubted it. She managed a small smile. "But I don't want anyone taking unnecessary risks. These men are professionals. So were you." Clay responded with a knowing look. "Some of us remember what you did before you were Mrs. Carson." Elizabeth had never spoken openly about her military background, but in a small town like Oak Ridge Valley, rumors persisted. Some, like Clay, had guessed more than she'd confirmed. After Clay left, Elizabeth checked on the kids, both asleep, then made a final circuit of the house, checking locks and security systems. In her bedroom, she opened the gun safe hidden in her closet and removed her Glock 19. She checked it methodically, the familiar weight comforting in her hands, before placing it on her nightstand. Sleep came fitfully, her mind cycling through scenarios and contingencies. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were filled with memories of missions long past, faces of those she'd trained, and the image of Blake Blackwell, a man she'd never met, but whose reputation painted him as the embodiment of the threats she'd spent her life preparing for. Morning brought a deceptive normalcy. Elizabeth made breakfast while Emma and Jack prepared for school, the routine familiar and comforting. As they ate, Elizabeth considered keeping them home, but decided against it. Better to maintain normalcy while she gathered more information. "I might be late picking you up today," she told them as they grabbed their backpacks. "I have some business in town. If I'm not there, wait inside with Mr. Peterson." The high school principal was a former Army Ranger and one of Elizabeth's more promising students. "Is everything okay, Mom?" Emma asked, her perceptive eyes studying Elizabeth's face. "Everything's fine," Elizabeth assured her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just some ranch business to take care of." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After dropping the kids at school, Elizabeth drove to town, her eyes constantly scanning for unfamiliar vehicles. Oak Ridge Valley was small enough that strangers stood out, particularly in the quiet main street lined with Western-style storefronts that had remained largely unchanged for decades. She parked in front of Moore's General Store, nodding to familiar faces as she entered. Clay was behind the counter, helping Mrs. Jenkins with her weekly groceries. He acknowledged Elizabeth with a subtle nod toward the back room. "Morning, Elizabeth," he called out. "Coffee's fresh if you want some while you wait." The back room of Moore's had become an unofficial meeting place over the years. Today, it was occupied by several of the valley's prominent ranchers and business owners, all people Elizabeth had trained personally. Ryan Cooper, who ran the feed store, stood by the window, his massive frame blocking much of the light. Beside him sat Sarah Martinez, the town's veterinarian and one of the best shots in the county. Tom Blackridge, no relation to the gang and owner of the largest cattle operation after Carson Ranch, was nursing a mug of coffee. Sheriff Roy Tanner completed the group, his expression grim beneath his mustache. "Glad you could make it, Liz," the sheriff said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We were just discussing our visitors." Elizabeth took a seat, accepting the coffee Clay handed her. "What do we know?" "More than yesterday," Roy sighed. "We've confirmed at least 10 members of the Blackwell outfit at the Miller property. They've been in town asking questions about water rights, property values, and which ranches might be in financial trouble. They approached me yesterday," Tom added, his weathered face tight with anger. "Offered to buy my east pasture at half its value. When I declined, they mentioned how unfortunate it would be if anything happened to my irrigation system during the dry season." Elizabeth felt her jaw tighten. Classic intimidation tactics. They'll start small, property damage, threats, maybe some missing livestock. Then they'll escalate. "We've already notified the state police," Roy said, "but you know how stretched thin they are. Might be days before they can send anyone." "We don't have days," Sarah spoke up, pushing her dark hair behind her ear. "One of my clients reported seeing armed men near Carson Creek last night, Liz. That's your property line." Elizabeth nodded, taking in the information without betraying her concern. "They're establishing perimeters, learning the landscape, standard reconnaissance. This isn't standard for Oak Ridge Valley, Ryan countered, his deep voice rumbling with barely contained anger. We need to do something now. We will, Elizabeth assured him, but we need to be smart about this. The Blackwells thrive on provoking reactions, creating chaos they can exploit. We need to present a united front while gathering evidence of their activities. She turned to Roy. What's the legal situation? Can we establish checkpoints, limit access to certain areas? The sheriff shook his head. Not without more concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Right now, all we have are suspicious questions and veiled threats. Nothing I can take to a judge. Elizabeth had expected as much. The law often tied the hands of those trying to work within it, which was precisely what groups like the Blackwells counted on. Then we document everything, she said decisively. Every interaction, every threat, every suspicious movement. We set up our own surveillance and share information. She looked around the room. And we prepare for the possibility this gets worse before it gets better. The meeting continued for another hour, with Elizabeth helping establish a communication network and scheduling increased patrols by trusted ranch hands around the valley's perimeter. By the time she left, a rudimentary defense plan was in place. As she walked back to her truck, Clay fell into step beside her. You didn't tell them everything, he said quietly. Elizabeth glanced at him. What do you mean? I saw your face when Tom mentioned the east pasture. You know something more about these Blackwells, don't you? She sighed, checking to ensure no one was within earshot. During my last year of service, I was consulted on a joint task force investigating organized criminal enterprises in the Northwest. The Blackwells were on our radar, but they were careful, never leaving enough evidence for federal charges. Clay nodded slowly. That's why you're really here in Oak Ridge Valley, isn't it? Not just because Michael had family land here. Elizabeth smiled slightly. I fell in love with Michael. That part was real. But yes, when we were looking for somewhere to settle down, I pushed for here. Isolated, defensible, tight-knit community. She looked around at the town she'd come to call home. I wanted somewhere I could protect. And now you're the one needing protection. We all are, Elizabeth corrected him. The Blackwells don't stop with one property. They'll consume this entire valley if we let them. Clay's expression hardened. Then we don't let them. Elizabeth was about to respond when her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Oak Ridge High School. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered. Mrs. Carson, Principal Peterson's voice was tense. I think you should come to the school right away. There are 2 men here asking to speak with Emma and Jack. They claim to be from the county assessor's office, but their credentials don't check out. Elizabeth felt ice settle in her veins. Keep my children in your office. I'm on my way. She ended the call and turned to Clay, her expression shifting to something he'd never seen before, the cold, calculating look of a predator. There, at the school, she said simply, trying to get to my kids. Clay's eyes widened. Go, I'll alert the others. Elizabeth moved toward her truck with renewed purpose, checking her concealed weapon as she walked. The Blackwells had just crossed the line. Now they would learn exactly who they were dealing with. Elizabeth Carson drove toward Oak Ridge High School with focused intensity, her truck eating up the miles of country road. Her mind operated on 2 tracks. Immediate concern for Emma and Jack, and tactical assessment of what this move by the Blackwells signified. Going after children this early in their operation wasn't just aggressive, it was a statement. They weren't just trying to intimidate her, they were declaring war. The school came into view, a 2-story brick building that served the entire valley's teenager population. Elizabeth scanned the parking lot as she pulled in, immediately spotting an unfamiliar black SUV with tinted windows parked near the front entrance. Wyoming plates, mud carefully splashed over the license plate to obscure some numbers. Elizabeth parked directly behind the SUV, blocking it in. As she stepped out of her truck, she activated the voice recorder on her phone and slipped it into her shirt pocket. Evidence would be crucial later. The school's front office was quiet when she entered, the secretary looking up with visible relief. "Mrs. Carson, Principal Peterson is expecting you. They're in his office." Elizabeth nodded, keeping her pace measured and her expression neutral as she walked down the hallway. Through the glass panel in Peterson's door, she could see two men in suits sitting across from the principal's desk. Her children were nowhere in sight. She entered without knocking. Principal David Peterson, a fit man in his 50s with military short grey hair, looked up with subtle relief in his eyes. "Mrs. Carson, thank you for coming so quickly," he said, rising from his chair. "These gentlemen were just leaving." The two men turned, and Elizabeth catalogued them instantly. The first was younger, maybe 30, with close-cropped blonde hair and a build that suggested regular gym sessions. His suit was expensive, but ill-fitting around the shoulders, concealing a weapon. The second was older, around 50, with salt and pepper hair and cold blue eyes that assessed her with clinical detachment. Blake Blackwell, she was certain. "Mrs. Carson," the older man said, extending his hand with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Gregory Matthews, County Assessor's Office. We were just discussing some property matters that might affect the school district." Elizabeth didn't take his hand. "Where are my children?" "Safe in the library," Peterson answered. "Ms. Wilkins is with them, the art teacher, another of Elizabeth's trainees and a former military police officer. I wasn't aware the county assessor made personal visits to schools to discuss property matters," Elizabeth said, her tone conversational but her stance shifting subtly to position herself between the men and the door. Blake Blackwell, or Matthews as he was calling himself, withdrew his unshaken hand with the same cold smile. "We like the personal touch, especially with properties as significant as yours. My property isn't up for discussion, especially not through my minor children," Elizabeth replied, "and I believe your credentials weren't in order." Peterson nodded. "The IDs they presented don't match any county records." "A simple misunderstanding," Blackwell said smoothly. "New IDs often take time to register in the system. We'll clear it up with the main office." "You do that," Elizabeth said, not moving from her position by the door. "In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you directed any questions about my property to me directly. Not to my children, not to my neighbors, to me." Something flickered in Blackwell's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her directness or annoyance. "At being challenged, of course," he conceded with a slight nod. "Family businesses are always sensitive matters, especially when there's been a recent change in management." The veiled reference to her husband's death wasn't subtle. It was meant to unsettle her, to remind her of her perceived vulnerability. Elizabeth smiled thinly. "Change can be difficult, but the Carson family has deep roots in this valley. We're well supported." "That's good to hear," Blackwell said, gathering a leather portfolio from the desk. "Support is essential in trying times. Things happen in these isolated areas. Equipment, failures, livestock problems, accidents." The threat was unmistakable. Elizabeth held his gaze, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. "Yes, we all look out for each other here," she finally said. "It's what makes Oak Ridge special." Blackwell nodded to his companion, and both men stood. "We won't take up any more of your time, but I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon, Mrs. Carson." "I'm counting on it," Elizabeth replied, stepping aside to let them pass, but maintaining a position that would allow her to intercept if they tried to move further into the school instead of toward the exit. As they walked past, Blackwell paused briefly beside her. "Beautiful children you have," he said quietly. "Your daughter has your eyes. Your son looks just like his father, from the photos I've seen." Elizabeth felt rage crystallize into something cold and sharp inside her chest. She kept her expression neutral, but allowed just enough of her true nature to surface in her eyes. "If you ever approach my children again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what happens next won't involve conversation." Blackwell's eyes widened slightly, the first genuine reaction she'd seen from him. He recovered quickly, smoothing his expression into practiced affability as he continued down the hallway. Elizabeth watched until they exited the building, then turned to Peterson. "I need to see Emma and Jack." The principal nodded, reaching for his phone. "I'll have them brought up." He hesitated, then added, "Those men, they're part of what you've been preparing us for, aren't they?" Elizabeth glanced toward the window, watching as the black SUV pulled out of the parking lot. "Yes, and this is just their opening move." Emma and Jack arrived moments later, both looking confused but unharmed. Elizabeth embraced them tightly, a rare public display of emotion that made Jack squirm slightly. "Mom, what's going on?" Emma asked, her perceptive eyes taking in her mother's unusual tension. "We're going home," Elizabeth said simply. "I'll explain everything there." 20 minutes later, the Carson family sat around their kitchen table. Elizabeth had checked and secured the property before sitting down to have the conversation she'd hoped to delay for at least a few more years. "There are people who want our land," she began, choosing her words carefully. "They tried to approach you at school today because they think targeting children will force me to sell." "The men who said they were from the county?" Jack asked, frowning. Elizabeth nodded. "They lied. They're part of an organization called the Blackwell Gang. They've done this before in other communities, intimidating families, creating problems, until people give up and sell their land at a fraction of its value." "Can't Sheriff Tanner arrest them?" Emma asked. "Not yet. They're careful to stay just on the legal side of things, or to make sure there's no evidence when they cross the line." Elizabeth leaned forward. "But I need you both to understand that these are dangerous people. From now on, new safety measures are in place." She outlined the rules: not going anywhere alone, checking in regularly, reporting anything unusual immediately. Both teenagers listened with growing concern. "Are we in danger?" Jack finally asked, the question blunt but necessary. Elizabeth met her son's eyes. "I won't lie to you. These people are threatening our home. But I want you to know that I'm prepared for this. The whole town is. Because of your training sessions," Emma said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's why you've been teaching people how to fight," Elizabeth nodded. "Partly, I wanted everyone to be able to protect themselves, no matter what happened." She took a deep breath. "There's something else you should know, something about my life before I met your father." Over the next hour, Elizabeth told her children more about her military background than she ever had before. Not everything. They didn't need to know the classified details, but enough to understand that their mother wasn't just a rancher who knew self-defense. "So you were like a secret soldier who trained other secret soldiers?" Jack asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and newfound respect. Elizabeth smiled slightly. "Something like that. I specialized in teaching survival and combat skills to special operations forces, and after I left active duty, I consulted on cases involving organizations like the Blackwells." "Why didn't you tell us before?" Emma asked, hurt evident in her voice. "Your father and I agreed it was better to give you a normal childhood," Elizabeth explained, "and for a long time, that part of my life wasn't relevant." She reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. "I'm still the same person, Em. This doesn't change anything about our family." "Except that now we're being threatened by criminals," Jack pointed out with teenage bluntness. "And now we're prepared to deal with it," Elizabeth countered. "I need you both to trust me. I won't let anything happen to you or our home." After the kids went upstairs, reluctantly agreeing to stay home from school the next day, Elizabeth called Clay to update him. Night had fallen by the time she finished securing the property, checking cameras, and setting additional alarms. She was coming in from the barn when her phone rang. Unknown number, she answered cautiously. Mrs. Carson. Blake Blackwell's voice was smooth, almost friendly. I hope I'm not calling too late. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the phone. What do you want, Mr. Blackwell? A soft chuckle. So you did recognize me. I thought you might. Your background makes for interesting reading. As does yours, she countered, continuing toward the house. Though most of it involves case files and criminal investigations, professional hazards, we all have them. His tone shifted, becoming more businesslike. I'm calling to make you an offer, Mrs. Carson, a generous one under the circumstances. I'm not selling my ranch. $8 million, he said, as if she hadn't spoken, well above market value. You and your children could start fresh somewhere beautiful, somewhere safer. Elizabeth reached the back porch, glancing at the security monitor before entering. The answer is no. It will always be no. You haven't even discussed it with your children, Blackwell said, an edge entering his voice. Don't they deserve a say in their future? Don't they deserve safety? They're safe with me, Elizabeth replied coldly, and they understand what home means. Home can become very uncomfortable, Mrs. Carson. Equipment breaks down, animals get sick, accidents happen to people who work alone on large properties. Elizabeth entered the kitchen, checking that Emma and Jack were upstairs. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwell? I'm offering you a way out before things get unpleasant. This valley is changing. Progress is inevitable. You can benefit from it, or you can suffer through it, but you can't stop it. You'd be surprised what I can stop, Elizabeth said quietly. Blackwell sighed as if disappointed. You military types are all the same, so convinced of your own invincibility. But you're not in a war zone anymore, Mrs. Carson. You're just a widow with 2 kids and too much land to protect effectively. Then why offer $8 million? She challenged. If I'm so vulnerable, why not wait until I'm desperate to sell? Pause. Because I respect efficiency, and contrary to what you might think, I prefer to avoid unnecessary suffering. How considerate, Elizabeth said dryly. The answer is still no. Sleep on it, Blackwell suggested. The offer stands for 48 hours. After that, well, the market is so volatile these days. The line went dead. Elizabeth stood in her kitchen, the familiar space suddenly feeling different, as if Blackwell's voice had somehow contaminated it. She checked the security monitors one last time before heading upstairs, pausing at each of her children's doors to listen to their steady breathing before retiring to her own room. Sleep didn't come easily. Elizabeth lay awake, mind racing with contingency plans and worst-case scenarios. The Blackwells were escalating faster than expected, going directly after her children, contacting her personally. They weren't following their usual pattern of gradual intimidation. Something had spooked them, made them abandon their typical cautious approach. Around 2 a.m., she heard it, the distant sound of an engine, too faint for most people to notice. Elizabeth was out of bed instantly, moving to the window. There, at the edge of her property where the main road curved toward town, a vehicle was stopped, headlights off. It sat there for several minutes before slowly driving away, a warning, a message that they could come and go as they pleased. Elizabeth grimaced. If that's how they wanted to play it, so be it. She reached for her phone and sent a message to the group chat she'd established with her core team of trained townspeople. Perimeter check, dawn. Bring gear. Responses came immediately despite the hour. These people, her neighbors, her friends, her students, understood what was at stake. Not just the Carson Ranch, but the entire valley. As she returned to bed, a new notification appeared on her phone. An email from an address she didn't recognize, with a subject line that made her blood run cold. The Blackwells aren't working. Alone. Elizabeth opened it cautiously. Inside was a single image, a photograph of Blake Blackwell shaking hands with someone whose face was just outside the frame. But she could see enough of the second person to recognize the sheriff's department uniform. Someone inside Oak Ridge Valley was working with the Blackwells. She stared at the image, mind racing. Who had sent this? Why warn her anonymously instead of coming forward? And most importantly, which of the people she trusted was betraying them all? Dawn was still hours away, but Elizabeth knew sleep wouldn't return now. She got up and began preparing. The Blackwells had made their first move. The warning email had complicated the board. Now it was her turn. By sunrise, the first trucks began, arriving at the Carson Ranch. Neighbors, friends, people Elizabeth had trained over the years, all coming together as they sensed the threat to their community growing. Elizabeth greeted them on the porch, the mysterious email weighing on her mind, but not yet shared. As Ryan Cooper's massive pickup pulled in, she made her decision. She couldn't trust everyone anymore, not until she knew who was feeding information to the Blackwells. But she needed her core team, those she'd trained most extensively, those whose loyalty she was certain of. "Let's get started," she called out to the assembled group. "We have a lot of ground to cover." The Blackwells had chosen this battlefield, thinking they held all the advantages. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Carson Ranch as Elizabeth stood before the assembled group of ranchers, shopkeepers, and townsfolk. 23 people in all, each one hand-picked and personally trained by Elizabeth over the years. They formed a rough semicircle in front of the barn, their breath visible in the crisp morning air, faces grim with determination. Clay Moore stood to Elizabeth's right, his weathered hands gripping a thermos of coffee. Sarah Martinez was checking her medical kit. As the town's veterinarian, she'd become their de facto field medic. Ryan Cooper's massive frame towered over most of the others, his usual jovial expression replaced by quiet intensity. These were the people Elizabeth trusted most, but the anonymous email weighed heavily on her mind. Someone in Oak Ridge Valley was working with the Blackwells, perhaps someone in this very group. "I won't sugarcoat this," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying across the yard. "The Blackwells are moving faster and more aggressively than anticipated. Yesterday, they approached my children at school under false pretenses. Last night, they offered to buy my ranch for $8 million. Murmurs rippled through the group. "That's nearly double market value," Tom Blackridge said, frowning. "They must want this land badly." Elizabeth nodded. "And when I refused, the threats became more explicit. They're not going to waste time with the usual gradual pressure tactics. This is going to escalate quickly." She unfolded a large map of the valley and spread it across a folding table. "We need to establish secure zones and communication protocols. The Blackwells have rented the old Miller property as their base of operations. But they'll have scouts throughout the valley, watching movement patterns, identifying potential targets." Elizabeth began marking areas on the map, assigning teams to surveillance positions and creating a defensive perimeter around the most vulnerable properties. As she worked, she studied each face carefully, looking for any sign of discomfort or hesitation that might betray divided loyalties. Nothing stood out. Everyone present seemed genuinely committed to protecting their community. "What about Sheriff Tanner?" asked Megan Wilson, who owned the local diner. "Shouldn't he be handling this?" Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Clay before answering carefully. "The sheriff is doing what he can within legal boundaries, but his resources are limited, and until the Blackwells commit a clear crime that he can act on, his hands are tied." She deliberately omitted mentioning the email or her suspicions about someone in law enforcement. Until she knew more, that information was too dangerous to share widely. "So we're on our own," Ryan said, crossing his massive arms. "It wasn't a question. We're on our own terms, Elizabeth corrected. We know this land better than they do. We have established relationships and communication channels. And we've been preparing for situations like this, even if most of you didn't realize that's what we were doing. A few grim smiles appeared at that. Elizabeth continued, I need everyone to be extra vigilant. Document everything. Suspicious vehicles, unfamiliar faces, any hint of threatening behavior. Use the secure messaging app we set up. Avoid discussing plans on regular phone lines or in public places. She looked at each person in turn, and most importantly, no one acts alone. The buddy system is now mandatory. The Blackwells target isolated individuals. After detailing specific assignments, Elizabeth held back her core team, Clay, Sarah, Ryan, Tom, and David Peterson, as the others dispersed to their designated tasks. When they were alone, Elizabeth lowered her voice. There's something else you need to know. She showed them the anonymous email on her phone. The reaction was immediate. Someone in the sheriff's department? Peterson's face darkened. That would explain a lot. We don't know for certain, Elizabeth cautioned, but we need to operate under the assumption that the Blackwells have inside information. That means adjusting our security protocols. Who do you think sent the warning? Sarah asked, studying the email. I have no idea, Elizabeth admitted. It could be anyone from a concerned citizen to someone inside the Blackwell organization itself. Ryan shook his head. So, we've got unknown enemies and unknown allies. Perfect. Focus on what we know, Elizabeth advised. The Blackwells want this land badly enough to bypass their usual tactics. That gives us an advantage. They're moving too fast, which means they're more likely to make mistakes or become more dangerous. Clay pointed out. Elizabeth didn't disagree. That's why I've called in some additional help. She checked her watch. He should be arriving this afternoon. Who? Tom asked, frowning. Marcus Reeves. We served together. He's been working in private security since leaving the service, and he owes me a favor. Clay raised an eyebrow. What kind of favor makes a man drop everything and come to the middle of nowhere on short notice? Elizabeth's lips curved in a slight smile. I saved his life twice. The meeting concluded with plans to reconvene that evening. As the others left, Clay lingered behind. You holding up okay, Liz? He asked, concern evident in his eyes. Elizabeth sighed, letting her guard down slightly. I don't like involving the kids in this. Michael and I promised them a normal life. Nothing normal about the Blackwells, Clay said grimly. They're not giving you much choice. No, they're not. Elizabeth's expression hardened, but they're going to regret that. After Clay departed, Elizabeth spent the next hour checking security cameras and setting up additional motion sensors around the property. Emma and Jack helped, asking questions about the equipment that Elizabeth answered honestly. They deserved to understand the protective measures being put in place. Around noon, Elizabeth's satellite phone buzzed with a message from Principal Peterson. 2 Blackwell men in town, asking questions at the diner. Elizabeth frowned. The Blackwells were being unusually visible, making no attempt to hide their presence or intentions. It was either extreme confidence or a deliberate strategy to create anxiety throughout the community. Either way, she needed to know what they were up to. Emma, Jack, she called. Both teenagers appeared from the barn where they'd been working. I need to go into town. You remember the protocols we discussed? They nodded solemnly. Stay inside, keep the security system active, don't answer the door, Jack recited. And if anything happens, use the panic button and then the escape route to the storm cellar, Emma added. Elizabeth nodded. I won't be long. 2 hours max. Yasin. She drove toward town. Elizabeth took an indirect route, watching for any vehicles following her. The main street was quiet when she arrived, just the usual weekday activity. A few trucks parked outside the hardware store, some locals getting lunch at Megan's diner. Elizabeth parked across from the diner and waited. observing. Through the large windows, she could see two men in dark suits sitting at the counter, the same younger man from the school yesterday, plus another she hadn't seen before. They were talking to Megan, who was nodding politely while refilling. Their coffee cups, Elizabeth's phone buzzed. A text from Megan. They're asking about water rights and property boundaries, very interested in Carson Creek. Carson Creek ran through Elizabeth's property, providing water for a significant portion of the valley's ranches during the dry season. If the Blackwells gained control of those water rights, they could effectively hold the entire community hostage. Elizabeth texted back, "Keep them talking, I'm coming in." She checked her appearance in the rearview mirror, then exited her truck and walked casually toward the diner. The bell above the door jangled as she entered, causing several heads to turn. The two Blackwell men glanced at her, then did a double-take as recognition dawned. Elizabeth smiled pleasantly, taking a seat at the far end of the counter. "Afternoon, Megan. Coffee, please." Megan moved to serve her, whispering as she poured. "They've been here nearly an hour. Asked about you specifically." Elizabeth nodded slightly, thanking her for the coffee before turning to face the men directly. "Gentlemen," she said, raising her mug in a mock toast. "Twice in 2 days, people will start talking." The younger man looked uncomfortable, but his companion, a lean, hawk-faced man with calculating eyes, smiled thinly. "Mrs. Carson, what a pleasant surprise." "Is it?" Elizabeth sipped her coffee. "Somehow I doubt that." The man slid off his stool and moved to sit beside her, extending his hand. "Frank Garrett. I work with Mr. Blackwell on property acquisitions." Elizabeth shook his hand briefly. "And how's that going for you?" Garrett's smile didn't waver. "Some negotiations are more complex than others, but we always reach a satisfactory conclusion eventually." "Always?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a claim." "We're very persistent." "So am I." Elizabeth set down her mug. "But I'm curious, why the interest in Carson Creek? The water rights are tied to the land. They're not separately negotiable." Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication that her direct approach had surprised him. "We like to understand all aspects of a property before making investments. Water is increasingly valuable in the West, as I'm sure you know." "Intimately," Elizabeth agreed, "which is why my late husband and I were careful to ensure those rights were ironclad. The creek serves multiple ranches. No single owner can restrict access." "Legal arrangements can be renegotiated," Garrett said smoothly, "especially when significant capital is involved." Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Garrett, let me save us both some time. No amount of money will convince me to sell my ranch. No amount of pressure will change that. And if you're planning to somehow force the issue, you should know that I'm not someone who responds well to force." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then chuckled. "Mr. Blackwell mentioned you were direct. It's refreshing, in a way." He stood up, adjusting his tie. "But business is business, Mrs. Carson, and sometimes the most stubborn obstacles require creative solutions." He nodded to his companion, who quickly settled their bill. As they moved toward the door, Garrett paused beside Elizabeth. "You have 24 hours left on our offer. I suggest you reconsider." After they left, the diner remained silent for several seconds before conversation slowly resumed. Megan came over, refilling Elizabeth's coffee without being asked. "What are we going to do, Liz?" she asked quietly. Elizabeth watched through the window as the two men got into a black SUV. "We're going to make them regret underestimating us." She finished her coffee, then made a circuit of the town, checking in with various members of her impromptu defense network. The hardware store had sold out of security cameras and motion sensors. The feed store reported unusual activity near the eastern pastures. The gas station attendant mentioned unfamiliar vehicles filling up in the early morning hours. The Blackwells were establishing a presence throughout the valley, their movements becoming more frequent and less subtle. They wanted the community to know they were there, to feel the pressure building. As Elizabeth was about to return to her truck, Sheriff Roy Tanner's patrol car pulled up beside her. "Got a minute, Liz?" he called through the open window. Elizabeth approached cautiously. The sheriff had been noticeably absent from recent events, and after the anonymous email, she wasn't taking any chances. "What can I do for you, Roy?" Tanner glanced around before speaking. "I heard about what happened at the school yesterday, and I've seen those Blackwell boys making themselves comfortable around town." Elizabeth nodded but said nothing, waiting. "Look, I know you think I'm not doing enough," Tanner continued, sounding frustrated, "but I've got procedures to follow, jurisdictional issues to navigate. These people are careful. They know exactly how far they can push without giving me legal grounds to intervene. I understand the constraints you're under," Elizabeth said carefully. "Do you—" Tanner ran a hand over his mustache. "Because I'm starting to hear rumors about private security patrols and surveillance operations. That's walking a fine line, Liz. We're protecting our properties, Roy. Nothing illegal about that." "Maybe not, but vigilante justice is a slippery slope." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "Has someone filed a complaint?" "Not yet, but I'm concerned about where this is heading." Tanner sighed. "I want the Blackwells gone as much as anyone. But if this erupts into open conflict, innocent people could get hurt. Which is why we're being careful and methodical," Elizabeth countered. "Unlike the Blackwells, who approached my children at school and are now making explicit threats." Tanner had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I heard about that. I've already warned them about impersonating county officials, and I'm sure they were very apologetic," Elizabeth said dryly. "Just keep me in the loop, okay? I can't help if I don't." "Know what's happening," Elizabeth nodded non-committally. As Tanner drove away, she couldn't help wondering if he was genuinely concerned about the community or gathering information for other purposes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Clay. "Your friend arrived, brought equipment. Meeting at my place at 7 p.m. Elizabeth felt a slight sense of relief. Marcus Reeves was one of the few people from her former life that she trusted implicitly. If anyone could help them identify who might be working with the Blackwells, it was him. As she drove back to the ranch, Elizabeth noticed a truck parked on a ridge overlooking the property. She slowed, reaching for her binoculars. Through the lenses, she could make out a man with a camera, featuring a telephoto lens, taking pictures of her home, her land, her children working in the yard. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. Documentation was part of the Blackwell playbook. Gathering intelligence, identifying vulnerabilities, creating pressure points. She memorized the truck's license plate and continued driving, making no indication that she'd spotted the surveillance. When she arrived home, Emma and Jack were on the porch swing, tension evident in their postures, despite attempts to appear normal. "Everything okay?" Elizabeth asked, scanning the property for signs of disturbance. "We had visitors," Emma said, her voice steady but eyes serious. "Two men in a pickup. They drove up to the gate but didn't come in. Just sat there watching the house for about 10 minutes, then left." "Did you get a look at them?" Jack nodded. "I used the binoculars from upstairs. Took pictures too." He handed Elizabeth his phone, showing close-up shots of two rough-looking men in their 30s, not the suited professionals she'd encountered in town, but hired muscle. "Good work," Elizabeth said, proud of their initiative but concerned by the escalating surveillance. "Pack overnight bags, both of you, enough for a few days." "Are we leaving?" Emma asked, alarm evident in her voice. "No. But I want you to stay with the Petersons in town for a little while." "It'll be safer." Jack frowned. "We're not abandoning you, Mom." "You're not," Elizabeth assured him. "You're helping me focus on dealing with this situation without worrying about you being isolated out here." She saw the reluctance in their faces, but also the understanding. They knew the stakes. While the kids packed, Elizabeth received another text from an unknown number. Opening it revealed a different photograph, this one showing Blake Blackwell, in conversation with what appeared to be a group of men studying maps spread across the hood of a vehicle. The location was recognizable as Crescent Ridge, which overlooked the valley's main water sources. A second text followed. Meeting tonight. Planning water diversion, Carson Creek. Elizabeth stared at the message. Diverting Carson Creek would be catastrophic for the valley, particularly with the dry season approaching. It would also be illegal, but by the time legal remedies could be pursued, the damage would be done. Shaki, Blackwells were accelerating their timeline. No longer content with pressuring her to sell, they were preparing to directly attack the valley's resources. As Elizabeth drove her children to the Petersons' home in town, her mind raced with preparations. For the evening's meeting, the Blackwells had declared war not just on her family, but on the entire community's way of life. Now she would show them exactly who they were dealing with. Clay Moore's farmhouse sat nestled against the western hills, its weathered boards and wraparound porch speaking to generations of family history. Tonight, it served as the command center for their resistance against the Blackwell gang. Elizabeth parked behind the barn, noting the collection of trucks and SUVs already there, all positioned to be invisible from the main road. Security had been tightened. Two ranchers Elizabeth recognized as former military stood watch at strategic points around the property, communicating via hand signals as she approached. Inside, the spacious living room had been transformed. Maps spread across tables, communication equipment set up on makeshift workstations, weapons cleaning kits laid out methodically. In the center of it all stood a man Elizabeth hadn't seen in nearly 8 years. Marcus Reeves cut an imposing figure, 6'3" with broad shoulders, close-cropped salt and pepper hair, and a neatly trimmed beard. The scar running along his left jaw was new, but the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes was exactly as she remembered. "Carson," he greeted her with a nod, military formality giving way to a small smile. "Still finding trouble in quiet places?" "Reeves," she returned with equal measure, "still looking like you got dragged through hell backward." They clasped hands firmly, the shared history between them making further greetings unnecessary. Clay watched with raised eyebrows, clearly reassessing his understanding of Elizabeth's past connections. "Your friend brought toys," he commented, gesturing to several cases of equipment stacked against the wall. Marcus shrugged. "Basic surveillance package. Nothing military grade, but better than what you'd find at the local electronics store." Elizabeth surveyed the room, noting who was present. Her core team had assembled: Clay, Sarah, Ryan, Tom, and Principal Peterson, plus 5 others she'd personally trained to advanced levels. Marcus had brought 2 associates, former operators who now worked with his security firm. Conspicuously absent was Sheriff Tanner, a deliberate exclusion, until Elizabeth could determine his true allegiances. "Let's get started," she said, moving to the central table. "Marcus, what's your assessment?" Marcus activated a tablet displaying satellite imagery of the valley that was considerably more detailed than anything they'd had access to previously. "From what I've gathered in the past few hours, you're dealing with a sophisticated operation," he began, his voice crisp and professional. "The Blackwell group has approximately 15 men on the ground, split between their base at the Miller property and various surveillance positions throughout the valley." He zoomed in on several marked locations. "They've established observation posts here, here, and here, covering major access roads and key properties. Their communications are encrypted but basic. Vehicle assets include 4 SUVs, 2 pickup trucks, and a larger supply truck that arrived yesterday." Elizabeth studied the imagery. "Armaments, standard security loadout, handguns, shotguns, possibly some semi-automatic rifles. Nothing military, but enough to overpower civilians." "We're not exactly civilians," Ryan pointed out, gesturing to the assembled group. Marcus nodded acknowledgement. True. Your training gives you an edge they're not expecting. But they have numbers and professional coordination. Elizabeth pulled out her phone, displaying the photograph she'd received earlier. According to my source, they're planning to interfere with Carson Creek tonight. Water diversion. Marcus examined the image. Disrupting water access is consistent with their usual tactics: create resource scarcity, then offer solutions at a price. The creek supplies water to 6 ranches during the dry season, Tom explained. Without it, we'd have to truck in water for livestock at enormous expense, which is exactly what they want, Elizabeth said. Financial pressure to force sales. Clay leaned forward. So we stopped them at the creek. Not so simple, Marcus cautioned. This could be a misdirection. While you're focused on protecting the water, they could be targeting something else. Elizabeth considered this. They've been pushing unusually hard, moving faster than their typical pattern. What's driving the urgency? The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the question. Finally, Sarah spoke up from where she stood studying a geological survey map. What if it's not about the ranch itself? She suggested. What if there's something else they want? Tom frowned. Like what? The Carson place is valuable, but no more so than 6 other large properties in the valley. Sarah pointed to the survey map. This is dated, but it shows geological assessments from when the county was considering new water wells. Look at this formation under the northeast section of Elizabeth's property. Elizabeth moved closer, studying the area Sarah indicated. That's mostly unused grazing land. Rocky, not very good for cattle. Exactly, Sarah said, but according to this survey, it sits on top of a potential shale deposit. The implications dawned on Elizabeth immediately. Oil, Marcus nodded slowly. That would explain the urgency. If they have information about valuable resources under your property, the land itself is just the access point. But mineral rights are separate from land ownership in Montana, Peterson pointed out. Even if Elizabeth sold, she could retain those rights, unless the sale contract specifically included them, Marcus countered, and these people are experts at pressuring sellers into unfavorable terms. Elizabeth recalled Blackwell's unusually generous offer, $8 million. That's what they offered me, far above market value for the ranch alone. They're not just after your land, Clay concluded grimly. They want what's underneath. Elizabeth straightened, a new clarity in her understanding of their opponents. This changes our approach. They're not just trying to intimidate me into selling, they're laying groundwork for major resource extraction. Which means they've almost certainly bought influence with local officials, Marcus added. Corporate interests of this scale don't operate without political coverage. The anonymous email warning about someone in the sheriff's department working with the Blackwells took on new significance. We need to protect the creek tonight, Elizabeth decided. But we also need to find out exactly who's involved and how deep this goes. She turned to Marcus. What about our mystery informant? Any thoughts on who might be sending these warnings? Marcus shrugged. Could be anyone from a disgruntled Blackwell employee to a concerned government official. Without more information, it's impossible to say. Elizabeth nodded, then outlined her plan. They would split into 3 teams, one to intercept the Blackwells at Carson Creek, one to maintain surveillance on the main ranch properties, and a smaller team to investigate the connections between the Blackwells and local officials. Marcus, I want you to lead the creek operation, she instructed. Take Ryan, Tom, and 4 others. Your priority is to document any illegal activity before intervening. We need evidence. Marcus nodded, already mapping out tactical positions. Clay, you'll coordinate ranch security. Make sure everyone is on high alert tonight. If they're hitting the creek, they might try to distract us with incidents elsewhere. What about you? Sarah asked. I'll handle the investigation angle, Elizabeth replied. "I need to know who's working with them from the inside." As the teams unprepared, Elizabeth pulled Marcus aside. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked quietly. Marcus's expression remained neutral. "What makes you think I'm withholding something?" 15 years of working together," Elizabeth replied. "You didn't come all this way just as a favor for old time's sake." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, always perceptive. He lowered his voice further. "The Blackwell operation has federal attention. There's an ongoing investigation into their activities across 3 states. Racketeering, extortion, environmental violations. But they've been careful, staying just within legal boundaries or covering their tracks effectively." Elizabeth processed this new information. So there are larger forces at play. Potentially. But official channels move slowly, and investigations like this can take years. You don't have years. "No," Elizabeth agreed. "We have hours." As the meeting concluded and teams departed for their assignments, Elizabeth found herself momentarily alone with Clay in his kitchen. "Your friend Reeves," Clay said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "He's not just private security, is he?" Elizabeth accepted a cup. "Marcus has connections in various agencies. That's all I can say." Clay nodded, understanding the boundaries. "And you? I'm starting to think military instructor was a significant understatement." A small smile crossed Elizabeth's face. "Let's just say I taught very specialized skills to very specialized personnel." "Thought so," Clay muttered. "You know, when you first moved here with Michael, some folks wondered why a woman with your presence would settle in a place like Oak Ridge Valley." "And what did you think?" Clay considered the question. "I thought you were looking for peace." "Now I'm wondering if you were actually looking for a place worth defending." Elizabeth didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. After leaving Clay's farmhouse, Elizabeth drove toward town. The night was clear, stars sprinkled across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on black velvet. Such beauty, she thought, contrasting sharply with the ugliness of what was unfolding in this valley. Her destination was the county records office. After hours, it would be empty, perfect for what she needed to do. Elizabeth parked a block away and approached on foot, sticking to shadows. The security was minimal, as expected in a small rural town. A simple lock on the side door, easily bypassed with the tools she carried. Inside, Elizabeth moved efficiently through darkened hallways, the beam of her small flashlight guiding her to the records room. Property deeds, mineral rights registrations, water access agreements, all the legal documentation that defined ownership and access throughout the valley. She began with recent filings, looking for any changes in property status or transfer of rights. Nothing immediately suspicious appeared until she reached a section of corporate registrations. There, buried among routine business filings, was a newly established entity, Oak Ridge Resources LLC, registered just 3 months ago. Elizabeth photographed. The documents, noting the company's listed directors, were all based out of state, with mailing addresses that matched known Blackwell shell companies. More interesting was the disclosure of local partnerships, including a name that made Elizabeth's blood run cold: Deputy Brian Walsh, Sheriff Tanner's right-hand man. The pieces were falling into place. Not the sheriff himself, but his deputy. A position with access to all law enforcement activities without the public scrutiny the sheriff faced. Elizabeth gathered what evidence she could, then carefully exited the building, leaving no trace of her presence. As she walked back to her vehicle, her satellite phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Activity at the creek, 6 men, equipment, moving to intercept." The operation was underway. Elizabeth started her truck, intending to join Marcus's team at the creek, when her regular phone rang. Unknown number, but she answered anyway. "Mrs. Carson." Blake Blackwell's smooth voice filled the cab of her truck. "Out for a late-night drive?" Elizabeth felt a chill. They were watching her. Just running errands, Mr. Blackwell, nothing exciting. County. Records at midnight? Seems rather dedicated for routine errands. Elizabeth scanned the street, looking for surveillance. Nothing obvious presented itself. What do you want? She asked directly. To congratulate you, Blackwell replied, surprising her. Most people in your position fold quickly. You've shown remarkable resilience. It's almost a shame we're on opposite sides. There's a simple solution to that. Take your men and leave the valley. Blackwell chuckled. I admire your directness. But business is business, and this particular business is worth considerably more than $8 million. So it is about the mineral rights, Elizabeth confirmed. Smart as well as tough. Yes, preliminary surveys suggest substantial resources beneath your picturesque ranch, the kind of resources that could power economies, create jobs, generate wealth. Progress, Mrs. Carson, inevitable progress. At the expense of this valley, its people, its water, collateral effects can be mitigated, Blackwell dismissed. But they're inevitable in any case. If not us, someone else. The resources will be extracted eventually. Elizabeth turned onto a side street, still watching for followers. Not if I don't sell. About that, Blackwell's tone shifted subtly. Our generous offer expires in a few hours. After that, events are already in motion that will significantly devalue your property. Your men at the creek, Elizabeth stated. A pause. You are well informed, but only partially. The creek is just one front in this negotiation. What's the other? That would be telling, Blackwell replied smoothly. Let's just say you might want to check on your children. The Peterson home is lovely this time of year, isn't it? All those large windows facing the garden. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the steering wheel, ice forming in her veins. If you go near my children... Then what? Blackwell interrupted, his voice hardening. You'll call the authorities? Deputy Walsh might respond? Or perhaps you'll rally your amateur militia, touching but ultimately futile. You have no idea what I'm capable of, Elizabeth said quietly. Perhaps not, Blackwell conceded. But I do know what I'm capable of. $8 million, Mrs. Carson. Final offer. I'll expect your answer by dawn. The line went dead. Elizabeth immediately dialed Principal Peterson's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She tried his wife next, with the same result. Abandoning all pretense of caution, Elizabeth accelerated toward the Peterson home on the outskirts of town, simultaneously sending emergency alerts to both Marcus and Clay. Possible threat at Peterson house. Children at risk. The quiet residential street where the Petersons lived appeared peaceful as Elizabeth approached. Too peaceful. No lights in any window, despite the hour not being that late. She slowed her truck, assessing the situation. The Peterson home stood. At the end of the cul-de-sac, a 2-story craftsman with a large front porch. Elizabeth parked a block away and approached on foot, staying close to the tree line that bordered the property. Through night vision binoculars, she could make out 2 figures on the front porch, men in dark clothing, standing unnaturally still. Guards. Inside, faint movement behind curtained windows suggested more people present. Elizabeth's training kicked in automatically, her mind calculating angles, approaches, vulnerabilities. The Petersons, Emma and Jack, were almost certainly being held inside, leveraged to force her compliance. She retreated to her truck long enough to retrieve her tactical gear, a vest, additional weapons, communications equipment. As she prepared, Clay's truck pulled up silently behind hers, lights off. Got here as fast as I could, he whispered as he joined her. What's the situation? Elizabeth briefed him quickly, outlining what she'd seen and what she suspected. Marcus, Clay asked, still at the creek with his team. This is a 2-pronged attack. Divide our resources. Clay checked his shotgun methodically. So what's the play? Elizabeth surveyed the house again. We need to know exactly where everyone is inside before we make a move. And we need backup. Already called in the others, Clay confirmed. Ryan's bringing 3 men. Should be here in 15 minutes. Elizabeth nodded. Good. I'm going to work my way around to the back, see if I can get my eyes through the windows. Careful, Clay warned. If they've got the kids, they've got all the leverage. They think they do, Elizabeth corrected grimly, but they've just made their biggest mistake. As she disappeared into the darkness surrounding the Peterson home, Elizabeth's mind was absolutely clear. The Blackwells had just crossed the line. From business tactics into personal territory, they had threatened her children. The night air carried a chill as Elizabeth moved silently through the shadows surrounding the Peterson home. Years of specialized training had made stealth second nature. The careful placement of each foot, the controlled breathing, the awareness of how moonlight could betray movement. She became a ghost, circling toward the rear of the property, where large oak trees provided additional cover. From her new position, Elizabeth had a clear view of the back of the house. The kitchen lights were on, silhouettes moving past windows occasionally. Through her night vision binoculars, she counted 2 more guards, one patrolling the perimeter, one stationed at the back door. Including the 2 at the front, that made at least 4 Blackwell men outside the house, with an unknown number inside. Elizabeth's earpiece crackled softly. "Eagle in position," Clay whispered, using the call sign they'd established. 3 more minutes until reinforcements arrive. "Copy," Elizabeth responded, her voice barely audible. "I count 4 outsiders, unknown internal, continuing recon." She moved closer, using a garden shed for cover. The back of the Peterson house featured a deck with sliding glass doors leading to the dining room. Through these, Elizabeth caught her first clear glimpse inside. Principal Peterson and his wife sitting rigidly at their dining table, a man standing behind them with a hand resting too casually near his waistband. A gun, almost certainly. Elizabeth scanned the visible rooms for any sign of Emma or Jack, her heart rate accelerating despite her training. Where were her children? The angle made it impossible to see the living room from her current position. She needed to get closer. Just. Then her earpiece activated again. "Eagle to Hawk. Ryan's team has arrived. 5 minutes to get in position." "Copy," Elizabeth whispered. "Stand by for—" She stopped abruptly as movement caught her eye. The sliding door opened, and a man stepped onto the deck. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a military bearing that Elizabeth recognized immediately, not one of Blackwell's usual thugs. This was someone with professional training. The man lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating hard features and cold eyes that scanned the darkness. Elizabeth froze, knowing that even the slightest movement could give away her position. As if sensing her presence, the man stared directly toward her hiding spot for several long seconds. Elizabeth held her breath, trusting in the shadows and her dark clothing. Finally, he turned his attention elsewhere, taking a long drag from his cigarette before speaking into a radio. "Perimeter secure. No sign of her yet." A voice crackled in. Response too faint for Elizabeth to make out. The man checked his watch. "Understood. 1 hour to the deadline, then we proceed to phase 2. He finished his cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and returned inside, sliding the door shut behind him. Elizabeth released her breath slowly, processing the information. Deadline. 1 hour. Whatever they were planning, it would happen. Then she circled back toward Clay's position, staying in the shadows until she reached the cluster of vehicles parked silently a block away. Ryan Cooper and 3 other ranchers were gathered with Clay, checking weapons and communication equipment. "What's the situation?" Ryan asked as Elizabeth approached. 4 outside. At least 2 inside that I could see, she reported. Peterson and his wife are being held in the dining room. No visual on Emma and Jack yet. "Any sign of Blackwell himself?" Clay inquired. Elizabeth shook her head. "No. But there's someone in there who's professional. Ex-military, maybe private security. Ryan checked his shotgun. So what's the plan? We can't just rush in if they're holding the kids. No, Elizabeth agreed. But we can create a distraction. She outlined her strategy quickly. Ryan's team would establish positions covering all escape routes from the house. Clay would create a distraction at the front, drawing attention away from the rear. Elizabeth would enter through the back, locate her children, and neutralize any threats inside. What about Marcus? Clay asked. Should we pull him from the creek operation? Elizabeth considered this briefly. No. Whatever they're doing there is part of the overall plan. We need to maintain that front too. As if on cue, her satellite phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Creek operation in progress. 4 men attempting to divert water with earth-moving equipment. Confrontation is imminent. Elizabeth relayed this information to the others. The Blackwells are moving on multiple fronts simultaneously. This is coordinated pressure. To force you to sell, Ryan concluded. By any means necessary, Elizabeth confirmed grimly. Let's move. The team dispersed to their positions, communicating via hand signals and whispered updates through their earpieces. Elizabeth circled back to the rear of the house, waiting for Clay's distraction. Minutes later it came, the sound of glass breaking followed by a car alarm blaring from the street in front of the house. Elizabeth watched as the guard at the back door tensed, speaking urgently into his radio before moving toward the side of the house to investigate. This was her window. Elizabeth moved swiftly across the open ground, reaching the deck in seconds. The sliding door was locked, but she had anticipated this. From her tactical vest, she retrieved a glass cutter, quickly and silently creating an opening large enough to reach through and unlock the door from inside. Slipping into the dining room, Elizabeth found it empty. The Petersons had been moved. During the commotion, she could hear voices from the front of the house, the guards responding to Clay's distraction. Moving silently through the kitchen, she paused at the entrance to the living room, listening. Waste of time, a voice was saying. She's not going to show up here. She'll come for her kids, another responded confidently. That's what mothers do. Elizabeth peered around the corner. The living room held 5 people, the Petersons seated on their couch, looking tense but physically unharmed. The professional-looking man she'd seen earlier standing by the window, and a younger guard positioned near the hallway leading to the front door. No sign of Emma or Jack. Elizabeth's heart rate increased as she considered the possibilities. Where would they be holding her children? The Petersons' home had 3 bedrooms, upstairs. Most likely, Emma and Jack were being held there, possibly with another guard. She needed to eliminate the immediate threat silently before alerting those upstairs. Elizabeth retrieved a flashbang grenade from her vest, non-lethal but effective for temporary disorientation. As she prepared to move, her earpiece crackled. 2 guards neutralized at the front, Ryan whispered. 1 fled toward the street. Clay is in pursuit. Good. The odds were improving. Elizabeth took a deep breath, then stepped into the living room, flashbang ready. The professional by the window reacted instantly, reaching for his weapon, but Elizabeth was faster. She tossed the flashbang, turning away and covering her ears. As it detonated with a blinding flash and deafening bang, the room's occupants cried out in surprise and pain, temporarily blinded and disoriented. Elizabeth moved decisively, closing the distance to the professional first. He was recovering faster than the others, confirming her suspicion about his training, but not fast enough. A precision strike to his throat, followed by a sweeping kick, took him down, his weapon clattering across the floor. The younger guard stumbled forward, still half-blind, and Elizabeth dispatched him with an efficient combination that left him unconscious. "David! Nancy!" she called the Petersons, who were recovering from the flashbang's effects. "Where are my children?" "Upstairs," Principal Peterson gasped, blinking rapidly. "First bedroom on the right. 1 guard?" Elizabeth nodded. quickly zip-tying the unconscious guards before moving toward the stairs. She ascended silently, pistol drawn, every sense alert for the remaining threat. At the top of the landing, she paused, listening. Footsteps approached from the bedroom, the last guard coming to investigate the commotion. Elizabeth pressed herself against the wall as a heavily built man with a shotgun appeared, scanning the hallway. When his back was to her, she struck, a precise blow to the kidney that made him gasp and fold, followed by a disarming technique that wrenched the shotgun from his grasp. The man fought back with surprising strength, landing a glancing blow to Elizabeth's ribs before she could subdue him with a chokehold, carefully applied until he lost consciousness. Breathing heavily, Elizabeth secured the final guard before rushing to the bedroom door. "Emma! Jack! It's Mom!" The door flew open, and her children burst out, throwing themselves into her arms. Elizabeth embraced them fiercely, relief washing over her as she verified they were unharmed. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" she asked urgently, checking them. "For injuries. We're fine," Emma assured her, though her voice trembled slightly. "They just locked us in here, said we were insured." Jack looked past his mother to the unconscious guard on the floor. "Mom, you were—" "Later," Elizabeth cut him off gently. "We need to move now. Stay close to me." She led them downstairs where Ryan and his men had entered and were securing the Petersons. Clay returned moments later, slightly out of breath. "Lost the runner in the woods," he reported. "But we've got the rest of them." Elizabeth nodded, keeping one arm around her children. "We need to question them. Find out what Blackwell's overall plan is." The professional she'd subdued first was regaining consciousness, glaring at Elizabeth with a mixture of pain and grudging respect. She approached him, keeping her children safely behind her with Ryan. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man spat blood onto the carpet, then surprisingly smiled. "Mason, former Delta, you've got skills, lady." "Why is Blackwell after my ranch specifically?" Elizabeth pressed. "The mineral rights?" Mason shrugged. "Above my pay grade. I just handle security operations." "Speaking of operations," Elizabeth leaned closer. "What's happening at Carson Creek?" Right now, something flickered in Mason's eyes, surprise perhaps that she knew about the Creek operation. "Diversion project, standard resource control tactic, and the 1-hour deadline you mentioned before." "What happens then?" Mason's smile widened. "That's when things get interesting. Blackwell doesn't like to lose, Mrs. Carson, if you don't agree. To sell by dawn, certain documents get filed with the county, paperwork that your late husband supposedly signed before his death, transferring mineral exploration rights." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "Forgery. Legal challenges take time," Mason pointed out. "Meanwhile, they start drilling test wells. By the time you could stop it legally, the damage would be done." Elizabeth straightened, processing this information. "Where's Blackwell now? You really think I'd tell you that?" Before Elizabeth could respond, her satellite phone buzzed urgently. "Marcus calling." "What's happening?" she answered. Marcus's voice was tense, the sound of shouting and equipment audible in the background. "We've engaged at the creek, there, using heavy machinery to alter the water course. We've stopped the immediate work, but they've called in reinforcements. At least 8 more men are heading this way." Elizabeth made a quick decision. "Hold position. Document everything. I'm sending Ryan's team to back you up." She ended the call, turning to Ryan. "The creek situation is escalating. Marcus needs support." Ryan nodded, immediately organizing his men to depart. As they left, Elizabeth turned to Clay. "We need to get the children somewhere safe, then deal with Blackwell directly. This ends tonight." "Where?" Clay asked. Elizabeth considered their options. Most locations in the valley could be compromised if Deputy Walsh was feeding information to the Blackwells. They needed somewhere unexpected. Sarah Martinez's veterinary clinic, she decided. It has secure areas for treating large animals, limited entry points, and medical supplies if needed. Clay nodded in agreement. "I'll arrange transport and security." While Clay made arrangements, Elizabeth stepped outside to call Marcus again, wanting more details on the creek situation. As she waited for him to answer, a familiar vehicle turned onto the street, Sheriff Tanner's patrol car, moving slowly with lights off. Elizabeth tensed, unsure of the sheriff's loyalties given what she now knew about his deputy. She withdrew into the shadows, watching as the patrol car stopped and Sheriff Tanner emerged alone, surveying the scene with evident confusion. "What the hell?" he muttered, taking in the subdued guards being loaded into Ryan's truck. Elizabeth made a quick decision and stepped forward. "Evening, Sheriff." Tanner spun toward her, hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm before recognition set in. "Elizabeth, what's going on here? Your deputy didn't tell you," Elizabeth asked pointedly. "The Blackwell gang just kidnapped my children." Tanner's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "Walsh said there was a disturbance call, but nothing about a kidnapping." His eyes narrowed. "What about my deputy?" "We found documentation linking Deputy Walsh to the Blackwells," Elizabeth explained, watching Tanner's reaction carefully. "He's been feeding them information, possibly helping coordinate their activities in the valley." Tanner's face hardened, genuine anger replacing confusion. "That son of a bitch! I knew something was off when he kept dismissing complaints about the Blackwells, but I never thought." Elizabeth studied him, concluding that his surprise and anger appeared genuine. "There's more. They're currently attempting to divert Carson Creek, and they've prepared forged documents to claim mineral rights to my property." Tanner ran a hand over his face, visibly processing this information. "This is bigger than I realized. Why didn't you come to me with this?" "Because I didn't know who to trust," Elizabeth admitted. "But right now we need all the legitimate authority we can get." "Will you help us?" Tanner nodded firmly. "Tell me what you need." While Tanner called for state police backup, Elizabeth organized their next moves. The children and Petersons would be secured at Sarah's clinic under guard. Clay would coordinate with Marcus at the creek. Elizabeth, accompanied by Sheriff Tanner, would confront Blackwell directly. "We know he's operating from the Miller property," Elizabeth told Tanner as they prepared to depart. "If we can catch him with evidence of the forgeries, and documented, in proof of the creek diversion, we can shut this whole operation down legally." "And Walsh?" Tanner asked grimly. "I have photos of the corporate registration documents linking him to Blackwell's company," Elizabeth assured him. "He won't escape." Consequences. Before leaving, Elizabeth took a moment with her children. "I need you to go with Clay," she explained, holding their hands tightly. "He'll take you somewhere safe while I finish dealing with these people." "Why can't you come with us?" Jack asked, fear evident beneath his attempt at bravery. "Because I need to make sure they can never threaten you again," Elizabeth answered honestly. Emma, perceptive as always, studied her mother's face. "You're going after them, aren't you? The men who did this?" Elizabeth nodded. "It's what I'm trained for, Em. I promise I'll be careful." "Dad would say you're being stubborn," Emma said quietly. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "He would, and he'd be right." She embraced them both. "I love you. I'll see you soon." As Clay led the children to his truck, Elizabeth turned to find Sheriff Tanner watching her with newfound respect. "You know," he said as they walked to his patrol car, "when you first moved here with Michael, people said you were ex-military. I figured maybe administrative, maybe a field medic." Elizabeth checked her weapon methodically. "People often underestimate what women do in the military. I'm starting to think everyone in this valley has underestimated you," Tanner replied, "including Blake Blackwell." Elizabeth's expression hardened as they got into the patrol car. "That's his final mistake." As they drove toward the Miller property, Elizabeth's satellite phone buzzed with an update from Marcus. "Creek situation contained. Documented everything. 2 prisoners, including a supervisor with direct communications to Blackwell. Another piece falling into place. Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The Blackwells' multi-pronged attack was faltering on all fronts. Now they just needed to cut off the head of the snake. The Miller property appeared deserted as they approached, but Elizabeth wasn't deceived. She detected the subtle signs of occupation: tire tracks on the dirt road, a flicker of movement behind a curtained window, the faint glow of electronic equipment visible through a gap in the barn door. "They know we're coming," she told Tanner, who had killed the patrol car's lights half a mile back. "Best to approach directly now. Use your authority as leverage." Tanner nodded, driving the final stretch to the main house and stopping in the open area before the porch. As expected, lights immediately came on, and several armed men emerged from both the house and barn. Elizabeth and Tanner stepped out of the patrol car deliberately, hands visible. Tanner, in his sheriff's uniform, provided an official presence that would make the Blackwell men hesitate before acting rashly. "Sheriff's Department," Tanner called out. "I need to speak with Blake Blackwell." A tense moment passed before the front door opened, and Blake Blackwell himself stepped onto the porch. He wore an expensive suit despite the late hour, looking as composed as if this were a scheduled business meeting. "Sheriff Tanner," he greeted, ignoring Elizabeth completely. "This is an unexpected visit. Is there a problem?" "You could say that," Tanner responded coldly. "Kidnapping, attempted extortion, illegal water diversion, conspiracy to commit fraud. Should I continue?" Blackwell's expression didn't change, but Elizabeth noted the slight tightening around his eyes, the only indication that the night's events had not gone according to plan. "Serious allegations," Blackwell said smoothly, "but I'm afraid you're misinformed. We're simply conducting legitimate business operations." "Save it," Elizabeth cut in. "Your men at the Peterson house are in custody. Your creek diversion operation has been shut down and documented, and we know about the forged documents you planned to file in the morning." For the first time, Blackwell's composure slipped slightly as he registered the comprehensive failure of his plans. His gaze shifted to Elizabeth, reassessing her with cold calculation. "Mrs. Carson," he finally acknowledged, "it seems I've underestimated you." "Everyone does," Elizabeth replied evenly. "That's why I win." The standoff had reached its pivotal moment. Elizabeth could see Blackwell weighing his options, the armed men around him awaiting direction. This confrontation would determine the future of Oak Ridge Valley and the safety of everyone Elizabeth had sworn to protect. The standoff at the Miller property stretched into its 3rd minute of tense silence. Blake Blackwell stood on the porch, flanked by 4 armed men, while Elizabeth and Sheriff Tanner remained beside the patrol car. In the distance, the sound of vehicles approaching broke the quiet, Marcus and his team arriving as backup. Blackwell's eyes flicked toward Dee. The sound, then back to Elizabeth. His expression shifted subtly, a businessman calculating losses and seeking exit strategies. "Perhaps," he suggested, his tone reasonable, "we should discuss this situation like civilized people, inside, away from all these weapons and tensions." "So you can claim we entered without a warrant," Tanner responded. "I don't think so." "We'll talk right here." Blackwell sighed, adjusting his cuffs, a gesture Elizabeth recognized as both a stalling tactic and an attempt to project control. "Sheriff, I understand there's been some confusion tonight. If my employees have overstepped boundaries, I assure you it wasn't under my direction." "Save the plausible deniability speech," Elizabeth cut in. "We have your man Mason in custody." "He's already talking." A flicker of genuine concern crossed Blackwell's face before he masked it. "Mason tends to exaggerate. Former military types often do. Present company excluded, of course, Mrs. Carson." Elizabeth's satellite phone buzzed. Without taking her eyes off Blackwell, she checked the message. It was from Ryan. "State Police ETA 15 minutes. Walsh in custody, caught trying to destroy documents at the sheriff's office. Perfect. The net was tightening. Your deputy has been arrested, Elizabeth informed Tanner, loud enough for Blackwell to hear. The state police will be here shortly. Blackwell's men exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the usual small-town intimidation. They were accustomed to handling. The situation was rapidly spinning beyond their control. Mr. Blackwell, Elizabeth called out, taking a deliberate step forward. You have two options. Surrender peacefully now, or wait for the state police and face additional charges for resisting arrest. Arrest? Blackwell's eyebrows rose in practiced surprise. On what grounds exactly? I'm a businessman conducting legitimate negotiations. Kidnapping my children isn't a negotiation tactic, Elizabeth replied coldly. Neither is forging documents or attempting to illegally divert water sources. Alleged activities for which you have no direct evidence linking me personally, Blackwell countered smoothly. Corporate liability is complex, Sheriff, as I'm sure your department's legal advisors would confirm. Elizabeth recognized the strategy, distance himself from the criminal acts while leveraging legal complexity to create doubt. It had likely worked for him before in other communities, without the resources or determination to fight back. But Oak Ridge Valley was different. Elizabeth had made sure of that. Actually, she said, we do have direct evidence. She held up her phone, displaying a video sent by Marcus, footage of the creek operation, clearly showing the foreman on a call saying, Mr. Blackwell wants the diversion completed before dawn. No excuses. Blackwell's confidence visibly faltered as Tanner added, and the financial trail connecting you to Oak Ridge Resources LLC, the shell company that attempted to bribe county officials, is quite clear. Your digital fingerprints are all over this. Operation Mr. Blackwell. The sound of vehicles grew louder as Marcus and his team arrived, parking in a semicircle that effectively blocked the main exit from the property. 8 trained community members emerged, carrying rifles and shotguns, positioning themselves strategically around the perimeter. Blackwell surveyed the deteriorating situation, his expression hardening. You've coordinated quite the response, Mrs. Carson. I'm almost impressed. He glanced at his men, giving an almost imperceptible nod. Elizabeth caught the signal instantly. Tanner, down! She pulled the sheriff behind the patrol car just as Blackwell's men opened fire. Bullets pinged off metal and shattered the car's windows as Blackwell himself retreated into the house. So much for the peaceful approach, Tanner muttered, drawing his service weapon. Marcus and his team had taken cover behind their vehicles and were returning measured fire, aiming to contain rather than kill. They're trying to create an escape. Window, Elizabeth assessed, checking her weapon. Blackwell will have a backup exit plan. What's our play? Tanner asked, deferring to her tactical experience. Elizabeth quickly analyzed the property layout. The house has a cellar with an outside entrance on the east side. He'll try to escape that way while his men provide covering fire. She activated her radio. Marcus, maintain suppressive fire on the front. 4 hostiles minimum. I'm moving to intercept Blackwell at the east cellar exit. Copy that, Marcus responded. We've got the front contained. Elizabeth turned to Tanner. Can you work your way around to the west side? Cut off that escape route in case I'm wrong about the east. Tanner nodded grimly. Be careful. Men like Blackwell don't surrender easily. I'm counting on it, Elizabeth replied, while Marcus's team exchanged fire with Blackwell's men at the front of the house. Elizabeth moved silently through the darkness, circling toward the east side. The old Miller property featured a traditional root cellar with exterior doors that slanted up from the ground, a common feature in older Montana farmhouses. Elizabeth positioned herself behind a weathered tractor, providing both cover and a clear view of the cellar doors. Minutes passed, gunfire continuing sporadically from the front of the house. Had she miscalculated Blackwell's escape route? Then she saw it, the subtle movement of the cellar doors being pushed open from below. A beam of light swept across the ground as someone inside checked for threats. Elizabeth remained perfectly still, waiting. Blake Blackwell emerged cautiously, a pistol in one hand, a briefcase in the other. He was alone, having sacrificed his men to cover his escape. Typical. He closed the cellar doors quietly behind him, then began moving toward a stand of trees where Elizabeth suspected he had a vehicle hidden. She let him get 10 yards from the cellar before speaking. "That's far enough, Blackwell." He froze, then slowly turned toward her, voice squinting into the darkness. "Mrs. Carson," he acknowledged, his tone almost conversational despite the circumstances. "I should have known you'd anticipate this move." "It's what I was trained to do," Elizabeth replied, stepping partially into view, her weapon trained on him. "Predict enemy movements, counter them before they develop." Blackwell laughed softly. "We're not on a battlefield, Mrs. Carson." "Aren't we? You targeted my family, threatened my community, attempted to steal resources essential for survival." Elizabeth kept her aim steady. "Sounds like warfare to me, just with different weapons." "Business," Blackwell corrected. "Aggressive, perhaps, but ultimately just business. The resources beneath your land are worth hundreds of millions. Surely you understand why my investors are so determined. And that justifies kidnapping children?" A flicker of something, perhaps genuine regret, crossed Blackwell's face. "That was an unfortunate escalation. Not my direct order, though I accept responsibility as the operation leader." Elizabeth wasn't interested in his justifications. "Drop the gun and the briefcase." Blackwell hesitated, calculating his options. The gunfire from the front of the house had diminished, suggesting his men were being subdued. In the distance, sirens could be heard, the state police approaching. "You know," he said, making no move to drop his weapon, "in all my years running these operations, I've never encountered someone like you. Most people fold under pressure. They take the money, they walk away. The few who resist usually lack the resources or skills to present a serious obstacle." "I'm not most people," Elizabeth replied. "Clearly not." Blackwell shifted his weight slightly. "Which makes me wonder why you're here at all. This valley, this small ranch, it's beneath someone with your capabilities. You could have done anything, been anyone after your military career." Elizabeth recognized the tactic, keep her talking, look for an opening. But she also saw an opportunity to understand her opponent better. "I chose this life," she said simply. "Family, community, purpose, things your money can't buy." "Noble sentiments," Blackwell acknowledged with a hint of condescension, "but ultimately naive. The world runs on resources and power, Mrs. Carson. Your little valley is sitting on a fortune that will be extracted eventually, if not by me, then by someone else." "Maybe," Elizabeth conceded, "but it will be done legally, with proper environmental protections and fair compensation to the community, not through threats and corruption." The sirens grew louder. Blackwell's expression hardened as he realized his time was running out. "Last chance," Elizabeth warned. "Drop the gun." Instead, Blackwell made his move, diving sideways while raising his pistol. Elizabeth was faster, having anticipated the action. She fired once, the bullet striking his shoulder, causing him to drop his weapon with a cry of pain. Elizabeth approached cautiously, kicking Blackwell's gun away before securing him. "It's over." "For now," Blackwell gasped through gritted teeth, clutching his wounded shoulder. "My organization doesn't begin and end with me, Mrs. Carson. Others will come." "And we'll be ready," Elizabeth replied, hauling him to his feet as Sheriff Tanner appeared from around the corner of the house. "State police just arrived," Tanner reported, taking custody of Blackwell. "Marcus has the remaining men contained. Looks like 2 tried to flee into the woods, but ran straight into Ryan's team," Elizabeth nodded, the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to ebb. "What's in the briefcase?" she asked Blackwell. Despite his injury, a smirk crossed his face. "Insurance." Tanner opened the case, revealing stacks of documents. property deeds, mineral rights assessments, forged signatures, and most disturbingly, detailed dossiers on key members of the community, including psychological profiles and identified pressure points for exploitation. You've been planning this for months, Elizabeth realized. Years, Blackwell corrected. Since the initial geological surveys indicated potential deposits, your husband's death simply accelerated our timeline. The casual mention of Michael sent a chill through Elizabeth. Well, what do you mean? Something calculating flickered in Blackwell's eyes. Heart attacks can be so unexpected, can't they? Especially in otherwise healthy men. Elizabeth felt the world narrow, a roaring in her ears drowning out all other sounds. Are you saying— I'm not saying anything, Blackwell replied smoothly, merely observing that timing is everything in business acquisitions. Before Elizabeth could respond, state police officers approached, taking custody of Blackwell. As they led him away, he turned back to Elizabeth one last time. This isn't over, Mrs. Carson. Some resources are simply too valuable to leave in the ground. Elizabeth watched him being placed in a police vehicle, her mind racing with implications. Had Michael's death been more than the tragic heart attack everyone believed? The thought was both unbearable and infuriatingly plausible. Marcus approached, breaking her dark contemplation. Elizabeth, we've secured the property. Ryan's team caught the last of Blackwell's men trying to destroy documents in the barn office. Elizabeth nodded, forcing herself to focus on the immediate situation. Any casualties? 2 of Blackwell's men were wounded. None of ours, Marcus reported. State police are processing everyone. They've called in a special investigative unit given the scope of what we've uncovered. Good, Elizabeth said distantly, her thoughts. Still partially trapped by Blackwell's insinuation about Michael, Marcus studied her face. What did he say to you? Elizabeth hesitated, then shared Blackwell's cryptic comments about Michael's death. Marcus's expression darkened. Could be true. Could be his final attempt to unsettle you, he said carefully. Men like Blackwell weaponize information, true or false. I know, Elizabeth agreed, but I need to find out for certain. Dawn was breaking as the Miller property transformed into a law enforcement processing scene. State police investigators documented evidence, took statements, and coordinated with federal authorities who had become involved once the scope of Blackwell's operation became clear. Elizabeth sat on the porch steps, watching the methodical activity, with a sense of detachment. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but Blackwell's final words echoed in her mind. This isn't over. Sheriff Tanner joined her, offering a cup of coffee from a thermos. State police captain says they've got enough to put Blackwell away for decades, he reported. The documentation in that briefcase is damning, evidence of similar operations in 3 other states. Elizabeth accepted the coffee gratefully. And Deputy Walsh? Singing like a canary trying to cut a deal, Tanner said with disgust. Apparently Blackwell recruited him 8 months ago, offering a percentage of the mineral rights profits in exchange for inside information and interference with any complaints. 8 months, Elizabeth repeated. That's before Michael died. Tanner looked at her sharply. You think they're connected? I don't know, Elizabeth admitted, but I intend to find out. Her phone buzzed with a message from Clay. Kid's safe. Everyone is asking about you. When can you come to Sarah's? Elizabeth felt a wave of longing to see Emma and Jack, to hold them, and assure herself they were truly unharmed. The rest, the investigation, the questions about Michael, the rebuilding of community trust, could wait a few hours. I need to see my children, she told Tanner, standing up. Can you handle things here? Tanner nodded. Go. The state police have jurisdiction now anyway. I'll call if anything urgent comes up. Marcus intercepted her before she reached her truck. I've got people monitoring communications and tracking financial movements linked to Blackwell's operation, he assured her. If there's any indication of a continuing threat, We'll know. Thank you, Elizabeth said sincerely. For coming when I called, for understanding without needing explanations. That's what happens when you save someone's life twice, Marcus replied with a slight smile. Creates a certain shorthand. Elizabeth managed a tired smile in return. Will you stay, at least until we're sure it's really over? Already arranged. Marcus confirmed. My team's setting up at Clay's place. We'll maintain surveillance for at least a week, make sure no loose ends come unraveled. Elizabeth nodded gratefully and continued to her truck. As she drove towards Sarah's veterinary clinic where her children waited, the Montana landscape stretched before her, painted in the gold and pink hues of early morning. The beauty of it struck her anew. This valley, these mountains, this community, she had chosen to protect. Blackwell had been right about one thing. She could have done anything after leaving military service. Her skills were rare and highly valued in numerous sectors. But what he failed to understand was that she had chosen this life deliberately, not as a retreat or a compromise, but as the fulfillment of something essential she had discovered about herself during her years of service. Protection, not just as a concept or a mission parameter, but as a calling. Protecting what mattered. Family, community, home. As Sarah's clinic came into view, Elizabeth saw Emma and Jack waiting on the front steps. They spotted her truck and stood, waving eagerly. The sight of them, safe, whole, resilient despite everything they'd endured, filled her with a fierce pride and renewed determination. Blackwell might be right that others would come eventually, drawn by the resources beneath the valley. But they would find something he hadn't anticipated, a community prepared, vigilant, and led by someone who understood precisely how to counter such threats. Elizabeth parked and embraced her children, holding them tightly as they peppered her with questions about what had happened. Over their shoulders, she could see Clay, Sarah, and the others watching with relief and respect in their eyes. They had all risen to the occasion, proving themselves more capable than anyone, including Elizabeth herself, might have expected. "It over, Mom?" Jack asked, his young face serious beyond his years. Elizabeth considered her answer carefully. "The immediate danger is past," she said honestly. "Blackwell and his men are in custody, but there might be more challenges ahead." "Because of what's under our ranch?" Emma asked perceptively. Elizabeth nodded. "Resources always attract attention, good and bad." "But we're ready now," Jack said with surprising confidence. "The whole town knows what to do." Elizabeth smiled, ruffling his hair. "Yes, they do." As they walked inside to join the others, Elizabeth knew there were still questions to answer, wounds to heal, and preparations to make for whatever might come next. The mystery of Michael's death loomed large in her mind, demanding investigation. The community would need to strengthen its legal protections against future incursions. Her children would require time to process everything they had experienced. But for now, in this moment, Elizabeth Carson allowed herself to acknowledge a simple truth that Blackwell had never understood. The greatest resource in Oak Ridge Valley wasn't what lay beneath the ground, it was the people who stood upon it. The days following Blackwell's arrest passed in a blur of statements, investigations, and gradual return to normalcy. Elizabeth's dining room had become an impromptu meeting place for state police investigators, federal agents, and community members. Evidence from the Miller property had exposed a sophisticated criminal enterprise spanning multiple states, with Oak Ridge Valley representing just one front in Blackwell's organization's ongoing operations. On the fourth morning, Elizabeth sat across from Special Agent Diana Reyes, a stern-faced FBI investigator who had arrived the previous day. "The scope of Blackwell's operation is larger than we initially realized," Agent Reyes explained, spreading photographs across the table. "Shell companies, political connections, environmental survey manipulation. It's textbook resource acquisition through criminal means. Elizabeth studied the network diagram Reyes had created. Blackwell appeared near the top, but not at the apex. Above him sat an entity labeled simply Investor Group. "Who are they?" Elizabeth asked, pointing to the shadowy upper tier. Reyes frowned. "That's what we're still piecing together. Blackwell is refusing to name them, which suggests they have significant leverage over him. Based on financial patterns, we believe they represent international resource interests using American fronts to avoid regulatory scrutiny." Elizabeth considered the implications. So even with Blackwell in custody, the threat might not be over. "Potentially," Reyes acknowledged, "but his arrest has disrupted their timeline significantly, and the publicity surrounding these events makes Oak Ridge Valley a much less attractive target. Criminal enterprises prefer shadows to spotlights." Elizabeth wasn't entirely convinced. Powerful interests rarely abandon valuable targets completely. "What about Deputy Walsh?" she asked, changing focus. "Has he provided any useful information?" "Some," Reyes said, flipping through her notes. "He confirmed Blackwell's recruitment timeline and corroborated the mineral rights forgery plan. But he claims to have no knowledge of any activities beyond basic information gathering and minor interference with complaints." "And Michael's death?" Elizabeth kept her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Has Walsh said anything about that?" Reyes's expression softened slightly. "Nothing specific, Mrs. Carson. We're investigating Blackwell's insinuation, but so far we've found no concrete evidence of foul play in your husband's death." Elizabeth nodded, maintaining her composure. The possibility that Michael's death hadn't been natural haunted her, but she couldn't allow it to consume her, not when Emma and Jack needed her present and focused. "I appreciate your thoroughness," she said, rising from the table. "Please keep me informed of any developments." After Agent Reyes departed, Elizabeth stepped onto her porch, watching Emma, and Jack helping Clay repair a section of fence damaged during the heightened security measures. The children had shown remarkable resilience, though Elizabeth had arranged for them to speak with a trauma counselor from the nearest city. Marcus approached from the barn, where he'd been coordinating with his security team. They had maintained a discreet presence on the property, gradually scaling back as the immediate threat diminished. "Surveillance shows no unusual activity in the valley," he reported. "State police have finished processing the Miller property. No signs of any remaining Blackwell personnel in the area. And your contacts in federal intelligence?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Marcus shrugged. "Nothing specific. Chatter suggests Blackwell's investors are re-evaluating their approach, but they haven't abandoned interest in the resources here." "So we remain vigilant," Elizabeth concluded. "Always," Marcus agreed. "But the situation has fundamentally changed. Before, they operated in secrecy against what they perceived as an isolated, vulnerable community. Now they face a documented, legally entangled scenario with multiple agencies involved." Elizabeth understood the logic, but couldn't shake her unease. Blackwell's parting words lingered. "This isn't over." The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Sheriff Tanner's patrol car led a small procession of community members. Clay's truck, Sarah's veterinary van, Ryan's massive pickup, and several others. "Looks like the town meeting has relocated," Marcus observed with a slight smile. Elizabeth had been expecting them. With the immediate crisis past, the community needed to discuss long-term security and legal protections. As vehicles parked in the yard, Elizabeth noted the changed demeanor of her neighbors. They moved with new confidence, alert but not fearful, greeting each other with the camaraderie forged through shared danger and triumph. Sheriff Tanner approached first, extending a small box toward Elizabeth. "Found this among Walsh's things. Thought you should have it." Elizabeth opened the box to find Michael's pocket watch, the family heirloom that had supposedly been lost before his death. It was in a locked drawer in Walsh's desk, Tanner explained, his expression grave. Along with these, he handed her a sealed evidence bag containing several small vials and a medical syringe. We've sent samples to the state lab, Tanner continued, quietly. Preliminary tests suggest a compound that can induce cardiac symptoms, virtually undetectable in standard autopsies. Elizabeth stared at the items, a cold certainty settling in her chest. The possibility she had forced herself not to fully believe now crystallized into terrible reality. Michael's death had been deliberate, part of Blackwell's calculated strategy to remove obstacles to his acquisition plans. "Does Agent Reyes know about this?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the storm of emotions beneath. Tanner nodded. "She's adding homicide charges to the case against both Walsh and Blackwell. They'll want to exhume Michael's body for additional testing to confirm." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. "Whatever they need. I want the truth documented beyond any doubt." The sheriff squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before moving toward the gathering crowd. Elizabeth remained on the porch steps a moment longer, processing this confirmation of her worst suspicions. Grief and rage intertwined, both tempered by the disciplined control she'd developed through years of military service. Michael deserved justice, and she would ensure he received it. But first, she needed to secure the future he had valued so deeply, their children, their home, their community. Elizabeth joined the assembled townspeople who had formed a rough circle in the yard. Clay had brought folding chairs for the elders, while others perched on truck tailgates or stood in small groups. The atmosphere was solemn, but resolute. "Thank you all for coming," Elizabeth began. "I know we're all trying to return to normal routines, but we need to discuss what happens next." Tom Blackridge nodded from where he leaned against his truck. "Blackwell might be locked up, but those mineral deposits aren't going anywhere. Others will come, especially now that their existence has been confirmed through all this legal documentation," Sarah added. Elizabeth acknowledged their concerns. "You're right, which is why we need to be proactive rather than reactive." She outlined a three-part strategy she had developed with input from Marcus and Agent Reyes. First, legal protections, creating a formal community conservation covenant that would place strict environmental conditions on any resource development, making quick profit extraction economically unfeasible. Second, security protocols, maintaining the communication network and surveillance systems they had established, with regular training to ensure readiness. Third, public transparency, documenting and publicizing Blackwell's methods to deter similar attempts and alert other communities to recognize warning signs. The most effective defense against operations like Blackwell's is removing the shadows they need to operate, Elizabeth explained. When communities are informed and connected, predatory acquisition becomes much more difficult. Discussion continued for over an hour, community members contributing ideas and raising concerns. Principal Peterson offered to develop an educational component for the school, teaching children age-appropriate awareness without creating fear. Sarah suggested coordinating with neighboring valleys to extend their information network. Ryan proposed regular security exercises to maintain readiness. Throughout the conversation, Elizabeth observed a transformation that both moved and reassured her. These weren't frightened individuals seeking protection. They were engaged citizens, taking ownership of their collective security. The skills she had taught them had evolved beyond physical techniques into something more profound, a mindset of preparedness and mutual support. As the formal meeting concluded and conversations broke into smaller groups, Clay approached Elizabeth. "There's something we've been discussing," he said, gesturing to several of the original core team members who had gathered nearby. "We think it's time to formalize what you've been doing all along." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Valley Security Council," Clay explained, a recognized entity that coordinates training, shares information, and liaises with law enforcement. With you as the head instructor, of course. You want to institutionalize our improvised resistance network? Elizabeth asked, surprised by the suggestion. Ryan joined them, nodding enthusiastically. Not just for Oak Ridge. We've been talking with folks from neighboring communities. They've heard what happened here, and they want similar preparation. Elizabeth hadn't considered expanding her training beyond Oak Ridge Valley. The idea of creating a formal structure, potentially reaching other vulnerable communities, presented an unexpected new direction. It's what you do best, Liz, Clay said quietly. You teach people to protect themselves and each other. Why limit that to just our valley? Before Elizabeth could respond, Emma called from the porch. Mom, Agent Reyes is on the phone. She says it's important. Elizabeth excused herself and took the call in her office, away from the crowd outside. Mrs. Carson, Agent Reyes began without a preamble. We've uncovered new information about Blackwell's investor group. They've made contact with federal prosecutors, attempting to distance themselves from his criminal actions. Let me guess, Elizabeth said dryly. They claim they were unaware of his methods and are shocked by his behavior. Exactly, Reyes confirmed. But here's where it gets interesting. In attempting to save themselves, they've provided documentation that directly links Blackwell to your husband's death. Internal communications discussing the removal of obstacles and accelerated acquisition timeline following his convenient passing. Elizabeth's hand tightened around the phone. Will it be enough to prosecute, combined with the evidence from Walsh's office? Absolutely. We're looking at first-degree murder charges for both Blackwell and Walsh, plus conspiracy charges for several others in the organization. Good, Elizabeth said firmly. What about the investors themselves? They've offered a settlement agreement. That includes permanent abandonment of all resource claims in Oak Ridge Valley in exchange for immunity from certain lesser charges. Elizabeth considered this. They're cutting their losses. For now, Reyes agreed. But they're still a powerful group with diverse interests. I wouldn't consider the matter permanently resolved. Neither would I, Elizabeth assured her. But it gives us time to prepare. After completing the call, Elizabeth rejoined the gathering. Outside, where the atmosphere had evolved into something resembling a community celebration, someone had fired up a grill, children were playing in the yard, and conversations flowed easily among people united by their recent shared experiences. Marcus found her observing the scene from the edge of the gathering. Good news, he inquired, noting her slightly altered demeanor. Elizabeth shared Reyes's update succinctly. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. Corporate self-preservation, he commented. Predictable, but useful. The murder evidence is particularly significant. Not just for justice, but for deterrence, Elizabeth agreed. It changes the calculation for similar operations. If targeting community leaders can result in murder charges, it raises the stakes considerably. They watched as Jack demonstrated to several younger children a simple defensive stance Elizabeth had taught him. Nearby, Emma was deep in conversation, with Sarah examining what appeared to be veterinary textbooks. They're resilient, Marcus observed, like their mother. Elizabeth smiled slightly. Like their father, too. Michael wasn't trained as we were, but he had his own kind of strength. He believed in building something worthwhile, something that would last. The ranch, the community, Elizabeth corrected. He used to say the land was just soil, without people who cared for it and each other. Marcus considered this. The Valley Security Council idea has merit. It would formalize what you've already been doing, create a structure that could outlast any individual. You think I should agree to it? I think you're already doing the work, Marcus said pragmatically. A formal structure just makes it more sustainable and expandable. Before Elizabeth could respond, Clay called for everyone's attention, raising a glass in the center of the gathering. "I'd like to propose a toast," he announced, his weathered face solemn. "To Michael Carson, whose legacy lives on in this land and these people." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd as everyone raised their drinks. And to Elizabeth, Clay continued, turning toward her with profound respect in his eyes. "Who taught us that even the quietest among us can become a force to be reckoned with when what matters is threatened?" The community responded with enthusiastic approval, raising their glasses higher. Elizabeth acknowledged their tribute with a nod, unexpectedly moved by this public recognition. As the gathering continued into early evening, Elizabeth found herself on the porch swing with Emma and Jack flanking her on either side. They watched, the sunset painting the valley in rich gold and purple hues, the same view that had captured Michael's heart when they first considered moving here. "Mom," Jack said quietly, "are we really safe now?" Elizabeth considered her answer carefully. She had promised herself never to lie to her children, even when the truth was complicated. "We're safer than we were," she said. "Blackwell is facing serious charges. His operation has been exposed, and our community is better prepared for threats. But complete safety isn't something anyone can guarantee." Emma leaned against her shoulder. "But we know what to do now. All of us." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, putting an arm around each of them. "That's the most important thing. Being prepared, being connected, watching out for each other." "Like your students in the military," Jack said thoughtfully. "You taught them to protect themselves and their teams." Elizabeth smiled at his insight. "Very similar, yes. Are you going to keep teaching people?" Emma asked. "With that council thing everyone's talking about?" Elizabeth hadn't yet made her decision. But as she looked out over the community gathered on her land, people she had trained, who had risen to challenges they never expected to face, the path forward seemed increasingly clear. "I think I might," she said. "There are other communities that could benefit from what we've learned here." "Dad would have liked that," Emma said softly. "Using your skills to help people protect their homes." Elizabeth felt a surprising sense of peace at her daughter's words. For years, she had kept her military background separate from her ranch life, viewing them as distinct chapters. But recent events had revealed the possibility of integration, using her specialized knowledge not for warfare, but for community empowerment. As darkness fell over Oak Ridge Valley, lights twinkled from scattered ranches across the landscape. Each represented a household now better equipped to recognize and resist threats, connected to neighbors who would respond at a moment's notice if help was needed. Michael's dream of a resilient community had been realized, though not in the way any of them had expected. And Elizabeth's skills, honed in distant conflicts, had found their most meaningful application in this valley she now called home. The widow who had trained every rancher in town watched her children against the backdrop of their communities, gathering, and allowed herself to acknowledge a simple truth. This was precisely where she was meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.